Welcome to Period 5 of the AP U.S. History Study Guide on the Gilder-Lehrman website. This short video will take us from 1844, when Samuel Morse sent the first telegraph from the Supreme Court building, to 1877 with the Battle of Little Bighorn and Edison's first light bulb. Period 5 of the AP U.S. History exam is marked by three key concepts: expansion, crisis, and rebuilding. As the nation expanded and its population grew, regional tensions, especially over slavery, led to a civil war, the course and aftermath of which transformed American society. This portion of the AP U.S. History exam focuses on the United States as an increasingly global nation, the deep social, political, and economic divides that tore apart the American people, and the rigors of rebuilding the country in the aftermath of war. Let's start with the first key concept of expansion. To start, here's a couple of reminders to set an appropriate context. Let's go back to Manifest Destiny. Always think about the philosophical and physical results of Manifest Destiny. With the proclaimed God-given right to expand, the United States did just that. With this initial push for new territory, the nation grew larger, and with that growth came the uneasiness of competing philosophies about how these new lands would be governed, and whose ideas would influence these decisions. Next, we have wars of expansion. We have to remember the conflicts that arose during this time, from the annexation of Texas to the fighting of the Mexican-American War. The key here is a newly established trend of fighting fiercely for an idea, and a great deal of land, and what price we'd pay to ultimately seal the deal to ensure the United States had geographic control of North America, and that control went undisturbed from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. This brings us to an era of compromise. As we move ahead, the next part of the conversation deals directly with how this kind of expansion would be hashed out by the people who would have to legislate and live life in these newly acquired territories. When this compromise fails, how do people, politics, and law move forward? Our discussion of national crisis can be split into three not so cleanly divided discussions: one of national policy, one of action, and one of civil conflict. So let's start with national policy. The first policy initiative is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. With its origins in a 1793 act, the first fugitive slave law established legal parameters for the capture and return of runaway slaves across state lines. This act was strengthened in 1850 when Congress made additional limitations for how states could interfere with the extradition of escaped slaves back to southern states. Despite northern states' attempts to legislatively circumvent these acts, they remained viable until their repeal in 1864. To dig deeper into this, check out Read and Ponder the Fugitive Slave Law and Ad for a Runaway Slave on the Gilder-Lehrman website. Then we come to the formation of the Republican Party in 1854. This party proposed new political foundations and principles with the abolition of slavery at the center of its platform. Its platforms also included the completion of a transcontinental railroad, free homestead legislation, and daily mail service. In that same year, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was ratified. It was based on the premise that popular sovereignty, when considering slave or free state status, would make for peaceful induction of these new states into the Union. While policy debates continued and decisions were being made regarding how new states would enter the nation, the public discussion about slavery raged. Check out the study guide site for letters from Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass's autobiography, and more abolition writings. Though some wrote and spoke about abolitionist philosophy and the desire for the freedom of slaves, others vehemently opposed the prohibition of slavery in the United States. This brings us to the years of Bleeding Kansas that lasted from 1855 to 1861. Following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the politics of the situation became the real deal, and people began to take matters into their own hands. Though the act was built on the premise of popular sovereignty, this really meant that people would flood into both Kansas and Nebraska in an effort to sway people towards the inception of either free or slave states. And when reasonable discourse failed, these people turned to violence to create their desired change. To better understand this, check out the letter, "This Whole Land is Filled with Blood" on the Gilder-Lehrman website. Unfortunately, the violence didn't stop in Kansas and made its way to the nation's capital. Following his Crime Against Kansas speech, Charles Sumner was beaten on the floor of the U.S. Senate chambers by a member of the opposing party. We see an example of the extreme side of what even the most polished and public Americans would do amidst this vicious debate over slavery. The courts would also weigh in on the issues that were tearing at the fabric of the American nation. Enter Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857. This case addressed the issues surrounding where slave ownership ends and freedom begins. Justice Roger Taney and the majority of the court answered this question clearly. Ownership is the law and would be maintained regardless of where the claim of freedom was made. Taney writes that regardless of Scott's move across borders into a free state, he was still a black man, not considered a citizen of any of the United States, and therefore could not utilize the rights of citizenship. The next step in this discussion is of one who wouldn't merely let the courts, the government, or anyone in an official position, continue with their inaction with the issue of slavery in the United States. John Brown, a proclaimed abolitionist, believed that his purpose in life was to ensure a future without the institution of slavery. He believed that a vigilante campaign would be the only antidote to action when government is just making the wrong decisions about fundamental issues. This stirs up an emotional and political question. Is one man's vigilante another man's freedom fighter? In 1859, John Brown and his sons conducted a raid on the U.S. military arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. In this failed attempt, Brown was captured and sentenced to death for treason. Check out John Brown's speech at sentencing to further your knowledge about his aims and desired results of this action against slavery. The serious question that remains is this: on the brink of crisis, what's the tipping point for an extraordinarily fragile United States? This brings us to key concept number 3, crisis. This era was marked by widespread domestic conflict, connected to very different ways of interpreting what American life should be. At this point, Americans moved rapidly towards a separatist sentiment. It was clear that people disagreed about some pretty fundamental aspects of life in the somewhat new nation, and after some pretty intense markers, a civil war was inevitable. With the Republican Party gaining ground in different parts of the nation, Abraham Lincoln won the party's nomination and sought to take the presidency in a time of great national division. As the Republican candidate, Lincoln's primary opposition was Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas. Lincoln's historic debates with Douglas displayed the extreme differences between parties and, in turn, those that would eventually divide the nation completely. With almost no support in the South, Lincoln won the election but did not win over the entire nation as his popular leader. Check out the Republican Party platform from 1860 and Lincoln's first inaugural address to get a real taste of how they addressed the issues and why. So at this point, talks of secession increase in the South, and the issue becomes one of real national consequence. The end result is the secession of Southern states from the Union and the election of a new president, Jefferson Davis, who would lead their efforts to maintain their political, social, and economic conventions. Except, they found themselves amidst the beginnings of a full-scale war with the Union armies. When thinking about the Civil War itself, think about it this way. First, Lincoln is elected in 1860. From there, we have the first votes of secession by Southern states, South Carolina in the lead and others to follow soon after. Once the Union and Confederacy are established as two completely separate entities, we have ourselves a bit of a civil war. Once the war begins, we get into dozens of battles. Both the Union and Confederacy celebrate wins and suffer great losses, including the First Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Fall of Atlanta. The nature of this civil conflict brought about a kind of fight that went beyond what any participant had previously experienced. Aside from the philosophical differences, these domestic opponents shared the historical experience of building the nation, strong, though opposing views, and, in many cases, family ties. To build a keen understanding of their experiences, look to documents on the Gilder-Lehrman website that focus on the daily lives of soldiers, both Union and Confederate, and how different aspects of the Civil War help us define the following national crisis. Okay, with all of that in mind, we have to look to the other side of the war, and here's a couple key things not to forget about this era. Lincoln does a series of things that will both bolster the Union war effort and completely change life in the United States. In 1861, he suspends habeas corpus. For this, refer to the Merryman case. In 1863, the President delivers the Emancipation Proclamation. That same year, he delivers the Gettysburg Address, a short, purposeful message to the nation about things past and how to build a stronger, greater nation than before the crisis of the Civil War. In 1864, with the establishment of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, we saw the changing face of race politics in the military. This brings us to the era of Reconstruction and reaction. So with the Civil War complete, the nation began to redevelop its identity as newly united Americans from both sides of the war found themselves needing to figure out their place in a very different nation. How would they respond? What would this reconstruction look like? These responses varied, from those who sought to take advantage of a newly united post-war nation in business and enterprise, to those who sought to maintain certain social and political conventions from the pre-war eras. Though we know all about it, make sure to include in your thought process that President Lincoln was assassinated just after the surrender of General Lee in 1865. Though the war was over, the assassination of the president was the initial marker on an extremely difficult road ahead for all Americans, regardless of what side they sat on. This brings us to Andrew Johnson. He was Lincoln's number 2, and chosen for his Southern appeal and his humble roots. Johnson was a staunch Southerner, and believed strongly that the South should rebuild its own institutions. Despite his high-ranking post, he maintained the thought that former slaves had no business taking care of themselves, or that they had the ability to do so at all. His support crumbled, however, when he began vetoing congressional acts, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Let's now take a moment to think about congressional Reconstruction. With the Freedmen's Bureau Act in 1865, Congress gave support to newly freed slaves and poor whites in the American South just following the Civil War. Through this act, the federal government provided food, housing, medical care, legal help, and schools, just to name some, to those in the South who were struggling through this Reconstruction period. 3 distinct constitutional amendments were also established and ratified. The 13th Amendment in 1864 abolished all slavery and indentured servitude in the United States, unless it was a criminal sentence. The 14th Amendment of 1868 was a pronounced Reconstruction Amendment that allowed for guaranteed rights of citizenship and equal protection under the law for all Americans. The 15th Amendment in 1870 provided enfranchisement to every American. Regardless of race, class, or creed, citizens of every ilk could now take part in political elections, local, state, and federal. Just following the war, secessionists were not allowed to run for or vote in national elections. In 1872, the U.S. government passed the Amnesty Act, which provided former Confederates full voting rights and returned to them their right to run for and hold public office. Resentment ran freely through every level of life in the South. From noted politicians to the poorest white sharecroppers, there was a widespread feeling that the new world of the United States ran in complete opposition to what the nation should be. 2 groups encapsulate the notion that a pre-Civil War South should rebuild with its own roots in mind. The Redeemers were Southern whites who rejected the widespread influence of Republican politics and the equalizing of American society for all citizens. Through acts of violence, murder, and political action, graft and intimidation, the Redeemers gained footholds all over the South, especially in areas where former Confederate leaders were regaining their rights as enfranchised citizens of the newly unified nation. Following a similar path, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan were another group that established itself in opposition to the Reconstruction of the post-Civil War United States. They executed a campaign of terror, fear, and violence against newly freed slaves and those that supported their enfranchisement in American politics and their entry into mainstream society. In addition, we have the Compromise of 1877, which effectively sealed the deal for these groups and the plans that were made. At this point, Rutherford B. Hayes took the presidency and effectively pushed out white Republicans in areas where Reconstruction policies were providing space for expanded rights of newly freed African Americans and the political agenda of the Republican Party. Wow, that was a lot. But now that we've covered all of that, make sure you go back to the Gilder-Lehrman website to take advantage of the timelines, resources, film, and the extensive document collection when studying for the AP US History exam. I'm here today with Tim Bailey, Director of Education at the Gilder-Lehrman Institute for American History, to talk about the thinking skills involved in the AP US History exam. Along with the multiple choice, the short answers, DBQs, and free response essays, you'll have to practice thinking like a historian to be successful with the AP US History exam. Hey, Tim.
Hi, David. How you doing?
Good.
You know, I was looking at the new AP test and the new AP course, and what I'm seeing is something that they're calling historical thinking skills that they're asking students to take on. And as I was reading through them, I thought they could be explained in a little bit clearer language. Let me give you an example here. We have historical causation. Now, this is the way they explain it. Historical thinking involves the ability to identify, analyze, and evaluate multiple cause and effect relationships in a historical context, distinguishing between long-term and proximate.
Okay. So basically what this means is that you have to be able to establish cause and effect while understanding the connections between multiple historical events. For example, consider the many factors leading to Lincoln's election in 1860 and the massive fallout that ensued. You'll need to be able to make these important connections on the fly.
All right, okay. How about this? Patterns of continuity and change over time. So we have historical thinking involves the ability to recognize, analyze, and evaluate the dynamics of historical continuity and changes over periods of varying lengths, as well as relating these patterns to larger historical processes or themes.
Okay, so look at it this way. History is made up of many interconnected moving parts. Your job is to establish how all of these parts work together across time and space. A good example would be the political history of slavery in the United States. You have to factor in every old compromise, deal, or issue that contributed to the start of the Civil War.
All right, okay, this one's kind of long. Periodization. Historical thinking involves the ability to describe, analyze, evaluate, and construct models of historical periodization that historians use to categorize events into discrete blocks and to identify turning points, recognizing that the choice of specific dates favors one narrative region or group over another narrative region or group. Therefore, changing the periodization can change a historical narrative. Moreover, the particular circumstances and context in which the individual historians work and write shape their interpretations and models of past events.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's simplify this a little
Okay.
bit. Putting more plainly, this means that historians work to break history into series of turning points, each based on critical events.
Okay.
Let's reach back for our first example. Christopher Columbus landing in 1492 began a period of exploration and discovery in the Western Hemisphere. And that's it.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, David.
And thank you, Tim. And remember, head back to the Gilder-Lehrman website for way more resources and information to be successful on the AP US History exam.